All right, everybody. Hello, welcome back. So this is part 3 of your week 5 lesson. So we're finishing up on your chapter 7 material on diversity here. And where we left off was looking at the concept of privilege and intersectionality and discrimination. So when we left off, we were looking at the concept of intersectionality, right? That based on the different dimensions of a person's identity and how the different dimensions of our identity and those different factors of diversity, how they intersect with one another, that might make it more likely for a person to experience prejudice, discrimination, oppression, based on their identity. And so this is one of the concepts that we're very concerned and interested about in community psychology, because of course we're concerned with preventing discrimination and oppression from people from going through these kinds of experiences, because we know that being on the receiving end of discrimination and oppression is very stressful, can lead to negative health outcomes, psychological health outcomes, etc. So we just need to be conscious of how social advantages and privileges and disadvantages and oppression, how they affect people in a very real way on a day-to-day basis, because there are certain aspects of a person's identity that can be associated with, again, higher levels of discrimination, be it skin color, religion, sexual orientation, experience of ability or disability, etc. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Now, this other concept that we're seeing here, difference versus sameness paradigm, this is really referring to how we go about describing the way that we appreciate diversity and celebrate diversity. Historically, in the past few decades, one way that people would sometimes say that they did not hold any racist beliefs is by saying things that, everyone's the same to them, or, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, everyone's the same color, etc. What this can unconsciously communicate, unfortunately, is that, perhaps there is something wrong with being different skin colors, right? When we really know that there is not anything wrong with having different skin colors. So, instead of saying things like that, what we try to do in community psychology is actually say, it's okay that we're different. It's okay that you and I have different skin colors, and that you and I come from different religions and have different sexual orientations, and maybe I have a disability and you don't, or vice versa, and that kind of thing, right? So what we try to do in community psychology is, instead of painting everybody with the same brush and saying, everyone's the same and etc., we actually say, well, no, everyone's not actually the same. There are a lot of differences amongst us as human beings, and that's okay, right? That's okay that there are differences amongst us. And in fact, if we can accept and appreciate our differences, we can start to see how different people bring strengths and weaknesses, to the table based on their individual identities. So that's when we start to get into a real appreciation and celebration of diversity, by actually acknowledging that people are different from one another, and instead of tiptoeing and walking on eggshells and saying, no, we're all equal, everything's all the same, etc., saying, no, I do come from a different background than you, or, vice versa, and there's real strength in that, and how can we develop that? Because, of course, we're very, very concerned with preventing experiences of oppression in society. And when we sweep these kinds of differences under the rug, so to say, that's one potential way that discrimination and oppression can sort of unconsciously get power, essentially, if I can put it that way. Now, oppression in and of itself is when a dominant or privileged group unjustly holds power and resources from another group that they consider to be subordinate or oppressed. Now, these are often based on characteristics that are fixed at birth that are otherwise outside of our personal control. Things like our ethnicity, the color of our skin, our gender, our sexual orientation, our religion, etc. So when it comes to how oppression is, how it happens on a day-to-day basis, we often find that a dominant or privileged group will control things like economic resources, status, influence, socio-political power, interpersonal connections, power to frame conflict, for example, etc. So these are all very serious things that can have immediate, acute impacts on people's lives. And what we often find as well is that when people live in a society that is oppressive, especially if they are members of the oppressed population. For example, the classic example would be like World War II Germany, right, where the Jewish population was very severely oppressed, or, apartheid South Africa, where white South Africans held the power and black South Africans, lived in severe conditions of oppression. What we find is that the people who come from that oppressed group, that even though they might know that, in their hearts, they're really not less than, the dominant group, they can start to internalize some of these terrible things that are happening to them on a day-to-day basis, so that they actually really do start to believe that they're inferior, even though we know that they're not, even though, you and I know that historically speaking, looking back at South Africa apartheid, or, what happened in World War II with the Holocaust, that Jewish people are not inferior, that black South Africans are not inferior. No one person is inferior than another person, that, these are all terrible things that have happened in our history. But unfortunately, that is one of the things that can also start to happen, is this sense of internalized oppression, that my group, right, if I'm a member of the oppressed group, is actually maybe in some way inferior. Now, what this is all really about is, how we interact with one another with groups that are different from our own. And there has been this human tendency over centuries, to have positive, what we call in-group attitudes, and develop stereotypes or prejudices or discrimination toward people who do not belong to our group. So we would call that kind of an in-group, out-group dynamic, that members of our own group we might have much more positive feelings and beliefs about, and members of groups of people who are not familiar to us, that we might have negative views about these groups. And this is why that sameness difference paradigm becomes so important, right? Because if we can acknowledge that, if someone's different from us, but still okay, right? Still could be a good person, then we can start to deal with some of this in-group, out-group nonsense that we all seem to do from time to time as human beings. So these kinds of in-group, out-group dynamics can occur for both dominant and oppressed groups, but it's obviously going to be much more harmful when it's practiced by powerful groups. And we need to be able to realize ethnocentric biases when we are trying to identify and solve these kinds of very serious social problems that can result in very serious expressions of racism and discrimination. So ethnocentric is a term you're seeing here, and essentially what that refers to is this kind of in-group, out-group dynamic, right, where we are more likely to have a positive belief about our own group and a negative belief about people who are outside our group that are not familiar. So this is kind of what we're talking about as a big thing that can impact and contribute to different forms of oppression Now, what we try to do in community psychology is to teach cultural competence, to teach people how to interact with groups that might be different than them, or with people, individuals that are different than them, and how to improve our knowledge and how to demonstrate respect for people who come from diverse groups. Now, we've got this nice kind of quote here that I like, right? That in community psychology, we try to take a professional stance of informed naivety, curiosity, and humility, right? So that's referring to this concept of, always appreciating that you could know more about another group, that, we try to respectfully demonstrate curiosity about another group. Oh, can you tell me a little bit about that custom, where that comes from, etc.? That's interesting. That's new for me, maybe. Being able to have that language, to have a discussion with somebody who comes from a different group than us is a really valuable thing to do. And that would be considered a part of cultural competence. We try to develop awareness of our own culture and how our own culture impacts ourselves, and how we view cultural competence as an ongoing process. Even if you are extremely familiar with other cultures that are different than yours, other groups that are different than yours, that you're always going to acknowledge that you can always learn more. There's always going to be more to learn on a day-to-day basis when it comes to interacting with people that are different from us. And the best way that we can think of in community psychology to prevent discrimination and oppression, rather, is to improve our knowledge of groups that are different from us, and of course practice respect and acceptance and tolerance of groups that are different from our group, right? And so that kind of diversity, respect that we practice amongst ourselves just leads to knowledge and understanding. And the more that we understand each other, of course, obviously, the less room there is for misunderstanding, for the types of tensions and toxic in-group, out-group relationships that can contribute to discrimination and oppression. So, my friends, this is really what we're talking about. Because, of course, at the end of the day, we want to live in a society that is equitable. One of my favorite sayings is that just because something is equal does not mean that it is equitable, right? So here on the left, we have 3 different people, right? So we've got 3 people of different heights. And if we were to give them the same box to stand on, no, not each one of these people would be able to reach the apple tree, right? They would not be able to get the food. However, if we were to adjust the accommodation, the box, of what the people can stand on to reach the apple tree, we see that, hey, everybody can reach, right? So this is a nice metaphor for us to leave our Chapter 7 content on, just for you to think a little bit about what we mean by the difference between equality and equity, and how sometimes life deals people certain disadvantages, be it, not being able to reach the apple tree, be it, perhaps having an element of our identity that has been traditionally discriminated against, and unfortunately perhaps is still being discriminated against, be that, because of the color of our skin, our sexuality, our gender, our religion, etc. So what we try to do in community psychology is make things equitable so that everybody has equal, equitable access to opportunities. So, quick recap for the different concepts we looked at. We talked about the different dimensions of diversity and intersectionality, sameness and difference, and oppression. So, a lot of really big concepts that we're looking at here that can be difficult if these are new concepts for you. So you're doing great work, and we're going to pick back up on Chapter 8 in just a moment.